Welcome back to the Scholar Wealth Podcast. This week, a listener with $18 million under management is paying his AUM advisor over $200,000 a year and was told he can't possibly handle a portfolio that size on his own. We dig into whether there is really a threshold where self-management breaks down. Then a family with a longtime nanny on payroll is buying her a vehicle now that the daily drive to school has changed the job. We walk through how to handle title, insurance, and the choices that would make this clean for both sides. In our From the Field segment, we welcome back Lindsay Tanne Howe, founder and CEO of Logic Prep, for a conversation about how education is increasingly driving where families choose to live and how AI is reshaping both the college process and experience. So let's go ahead and start with question one. I have about 18 million with a wirehouse advisor, and I'm paying just over 1% on AUM and fund fees, so call it $200,000 a year. I sat down recently and actually added up what I've paid since I sold my company, and the number is staggering. When I brought it up to my advisor and floated the idea of managing it myself or moving to flat fee, he told me there was no way I could handle a portfolio the size of my own. Is he right? What's the threshold for self-management? What we need to do is disentangle this idea that managing money is the same as advice on money, because the advice on money is really where the complexity comes in. The management of the money is relatively easy, especially with the changes in technology that's happened over the past, it's called 30 years. And you used to be able to say, if you wanted to buy Apple stock, you have to call a broker, deal with all of this and go through it, and they would buy it for you and execute it. Now I can pick up my phone, jump on Fidelity and place a trade and buy Apple now, and in 3 seconds, sell it and not own it anymore. So it's become significantly easier to access financial markets for retail investors, which would be what you and I are. So that is one kind of myth we must dispel kind of early here, that the management can't happen. I think what gets conflated is people say, well, I understand the management piece, but I need the advice piece. And that's where you have to be careful, because you have to look and see whether or not the $200,000 or so that you're paying is actually worth the advice piece that you're getting. Because that's a heck of a lot of advice that you're getting, unless you have a lot of complexity. And the complexity doesn't come from the number that's in the account. What I mean by that is, if you have a $5 million account and a $15 million account, the account doesn't get 3 times more difficult to manage, even though the fee you're paying goes up by 3 times. Now, I know there's fee breaks and everything, and they're going to give you 85 bips or 80 bips as opposed to 1%, but it still doesn't move linearly. The whole AUM model is a linear relationship between the fee you pay and the amount of money that's in that account, which from an outside looking in seems fine. The problem is, in my opinion, that starts to break down quickly when account values start to increase. If you have $1 million in your account and you're paying $10,000 a year for a manager, that's probably not that bad, right? I don't think that's too egregious. Now, if you have a $3 million account from your $1 million account, now you're paying $30,000 a year. It's really hard for me to justify that you're getting 3 times the value from 1 million to 3 million. Unless your life became significantly more complex during that time, it doesn't make sense. And that continues. You go to 3 to 6, 6 to 12, 12 to 24. Where it starts to get interesting is in the spot that you're in. You start to get to this 18 million number mark and you say, well, this seems like a lot of money, and maybe I don't know what I'm doing with it. Now, does that mean I recommend you go take the $18 million and run it all yourself and never talk to any other advisor? Absolutely not. What I'm saying is, you could go out, handle your 18 million and find a really good attorney and find a really good CPA, which you probably already have, and find a financial advisor to charge you a flat fee for the advice as opposed to actually managing the account. And I think you could manage it. Then if your answer is, well, I don't know, that's a lot of stuff to handle. I don't know if I could actually handle the trades and place the trades and everything else. The big question is it worth $200,000 to you? Because if you say, well, that's going to be a lot more work, well, how much more work are we talking about? So you're going to have to put in some more transfers. Maybe you place the trades yourself and you rebalance it a couple times a year. How much time are you actually putting in this? My guess is you're putting in 3 to 4 days max worth of time. And that includes you getting into some horrible phone conversations with the broker you're at, trying to transfer money around, and you have to sit on hold for a while. So let's say at worst, 5 days to manage that. It's $40,000 a day that you would be essentially getting paid or saving if you just spent those 5 days doing it. I think that's a good use of your money. Not only is it a good use of your money now, but what happens to you 10 years from now? Money doubles every 10 years on an average return of 7%, rule of 72, which shows that. So even if you're pulling the money from the account now, What happens if you spend some of it? What if this account gets up to $30 million in the next decade? What does that do to your fees? Now you're talking $300,000 plus, and you'd say, "Man, 10 years ago, I really wish I had spent those 5 days to make 200 grand to manage the account by myself so I don't have to continue paying 200 to $300,000." If there's That's 2 to $3 million you're gonna pay in fees over the next 10 years, which I know I'm preaching to the choir in this one because you've already done the math. You've seen how much it compounds. It's not just you don't have to pay it. It's $200,000 today that you save in 10 years turns to $400,000 with that average. So if that's the scenario, how much do you miss out not only today, but 5, 10, 15, 20 years in the future of all of these fees continuing to compound? That's where I really have trouble with that scalability of that AUM model. Works really well for the advisor. The scaling works great there. I don't think it works as well for the client. Now, the other part of your question is, what's the threshold for self-management? And this is an interesting question because it depends a little bit on the complexity, but I don't want to give you the it depends answer for it. In other words, if you have $10 million sitting in an account that's all in cash in one brokerage account with no complexity, that's not bad at all, right? I don't see that falling apart. You have 20 or $30 million in that same scenario. What starts to what starts to change is you start to get to the point where you start to hit that estate tax limit, which for a married couple, you're right around that $30 million. Once you start risking going into that, then there's some tax efficiency that's needed, right? Even at 10 to 20 million, tax loss harvesting becomes important, being more attuned to what the estate concerns would be. All of that makes perfect sense. Doesn't necessarily mean you need AUM at that point. What it means is you just need some advisors around you to help with that. Now, where does it kick in where you need someone to manage the money? That I think is what you're getting at. Where does the self management say, this is too big for me? I need to bring in someone to actually manage the day to day operations of this. My opinion, that starts to hit around 100 to $200 million. Once you start to hit that point, then you run into an interesting situation where you don't have to go to an advisor and pay $1 million to $2 million a year in AUM fees. You would just own your own advisor, right? You would just go and hire a financial advisor who does nothing but looks at your accounts. That's when you start to see family offices and everything start to generate because they do the same math that you're doing and say, "Hey, I have $100 million now, or I have $150 million. I'm about to go pay 800,000, $700,000 in fees this year, even with all the fee breaks. I could go hire me my own advisor. I could go hire an attorney. I go hire a CPA and a bookkeeper who does all of this for me throughout the year, and they only work for me and my family." And that's going to make a lot of sense because you get to 100 to $200 million. You've got some stuff going on, right? I mean, you've either have businesses, you have real estate. There's some other things that are happening here where you just don't have one account with $100 million in it. There's more complexity that you're going to need specialized advice on. You're going to be gifting to kids. You're going to be setting up different type of trust structures, different assets, multiple homes. There's a lot that's being thrown in here that you really would find a lot of value in having someone who's dedicated only to you and your finances, as opposed to saying, "I'm going to pay close to $1 million a year in fees, and I'm going to be one of the clients of this advisor who's working for me." So that's when I think that starts to break apart. But for 18 million, I don't see any issues there from at least from this limited information of you being able to handle this yourself with the right type of support around you, especially with the technology available today. All right, then we can go on to our next question. So we have a great full-time nanny on payroll for just over a year. Our older daughter has just started private school. It's a 40-minute drive each way, and now our nanny is doing 2 round trips a day plus the usual errands. It's a lot of mileage on her personal car. We want to get her a safe new vehicle to use for the job, but I don't know the right way to do it. Do we buy it and put it in our insurance policy? Do we title it to her? So lots of different options when we get into the concept of really you having employees for your personal life. And that's what you have going on now. So this happens when we start having nannies always tend to come in because you bring in the car aspect. But when you start having housekeepers and somebody helping take care of the yard, once you start having full-time people working for you, you have to start looking at this like a business arrangement and not just paying somebody on the side. The risk of what you're talking about doing is that insurance starts to become a big problem. And this is where we tend to see a lot of people get tripped up on it because they go and say, well, I'm just going to go buy a car and nanny can use the car and drive around the kids. It's not going to be a big deal. The problem is she insured now on the car? Well, now you can add her to the insurance. But then you say, well, if we're adding her to the insurance and she's running errands throughout the day, which is the key issue, I think, in this component, is if she starts doing that and she's running errands, then are you hiring her as a driver, not necessarily just as a nanny? And as soon as you start putting her literally in the driver's seat of this situation, then you start running into liability issues where the insurance companies can come in and say, well, you have her driving a personal vehicle. That's your personal vehicle. We're not going to cover business work that she's doing in the personal vehicle. So there's going to be this delineation of what is commercial use and what is personal use for this vehicle. So that's where you're going to run into some issues here. The cleanest method would be for you to go and have a vehicle for her to use. You can either title it in her name and have some sort of business arrangement, like a loan to her that if she's no longer working for you, the loan is automatically called or something along those scenarios. Or you have her keep her car and then you pay mileage on it. So she logs how many miles she takes throughout the week, sends it back to you, and you pay the mileage rate for that to work out. So in this case, super simple. And then you ensure that her insurance allows her to use her vehicle for her job and they'll still cover it. If the insurance that she has says, yes, you can use it for personal use and you can use it for your job, not a problem, then you can go ensure that that insurance is covering her correctly and follow up with helping her financially get the vehicle, whether that's some sort of payment in advance, whether that's some sort of loan. And that's relatively easy to structure with an attorney to put that in her name and still protect you from the fact that you buy her a new car and then the next day she quits, right? Which ends up being the risk there. The way that gives you the most control, but also the most complexity, and I don't know if that really makes a lot of sense here. I kind of like that second option a lot better. Is you could just go buy this vehicle as part of a business, have it truly for business use. She's an employee of the business, and you start running this more like a household business that's there. That way, you control the insurance, you control the vehicle, you have optimal control in that scenario. But the second option is definitely what I think you should be looking into, which is there a way for her to use a car that's her car that you help her buy, which is one separate issue, and then follow up that issue with, all right, now that you have a safe car that you can drive our kids around in, how do we go about making sure that we pay you back for the mileage you're putting on your car? So that's going to be done. That's relatively easy to do. And then we just check the box that says, show us the insurance that you have for coverage and make sure that that coverage allows you to use that car personally and for your job. And if you're able to tick those three boxes off of getting the car, paying her for mileage and use, and having the insurance protection, I think that makes a lot more sense than you running the risks of you buying a car personally, letting her use it for the kids, and then potentially having an issue where somebody says, well, she's actually a driver. She's doing all these errands, all these other household chores around the house. So that's a business use. That's not personal use. At Scholar Advising, we work alongside your full financial picture as independent thought partners for a flat fee, not as account managers or product sellers. We help you think through the options, stress test the decisions, and build a clear path toward your long term goals. Visit scholaradvising.com. And in our From the Field segment, we look at how education is increasingly shaping where families choose to plant roots and what that means for long term planning. Today, we're joined by Lindsay Tanne Howe, founder and CEO of Logic Prep, a premier college advisory firm that helps students tell their stories, gain admission to top universities. Lindsay joined us last year to talk about the Ivy League admission strategy, and we're thrilled to have her back. This time to explore a broader shift she's been seeing how education strategy is increasingly shaping where families choose to plant roots and what that means for how they plan for the road ahead. So, Lindsay, welcome back to the Scholar Wealth podcast.
Hey.
What's new? What's going on here with since last year? I know everything's moving so fast. What's been on your radar since we last spoke?
Yes, as you mentioned, I mean, we're seeing just an increasingly sort of mobile and global population of families. And we're seeing education sort of underpin a lot of the relocation decisions that families are making. And we're seeing this kind of in the secondary school selection process in terms of where do I choose to live? Where do I choose to send my child to school? How do I decide if this is going to be a good move for my family? And then, actually, in the college selection piece, where we're seeing students cast a much wider net in terms of international scope, looking at colleges outside the US. It's been pretty fascinating.
So is that when you talk about the actual move and everything, so you're talking everybody's picking up, moving to where their child's gonna go to college, or and that's dictating kinda where they're going? Is this like the pre-retirement move of you're only allowed to choose these locations because that's where mom and dad wanna retire, and we'd like you to move
Well,
to
it's
the.
funny, I did talk to a family not too long ago that said, I think we're gonna go explore, Bocconi in Milan for our son because we're kind of thinking about maybe retiring in, like a village in Italy." And so that's kind of, I would say, the exception case, but not happening. What I'm alluding to more is, families are increasingly mobile. Remote work is, much more a reality than it was, let's say 5 or 10 years ago. And families have more optionality. And what we're seeing is parents come to us kind of earlier in the schooling trajectory for their children and say, we're contemplating a family move for career reasons, for lifestyle reasons. And we want to be really thoughtful and mindful about how this is going to map to educational planning for our child. Are the schools in this new location good enough to give them the kind of college access that they might hopefully aspire to one day? Or even, is there an advantage to moving to kind of a school ecosystem that's maybe been historically less competitive, kind of less saturated with students who are aiming for the most highly selective colleges? Like a sort of classic kind of cocktail party example of that is, to be talking to a family in Greenwich, Connecticut, for example, that says, we have a ski house in Montana or in Idaho. Could my child do better coming out of high school there? Are they going to stand out more in the admissions process? And sometimes the answer is kind of yes.
Does Can you talk about that a little bit more? That's really interesting of how that you'd almost do the opposite of what most people would think of instead of going for the areas that have all the great schools and everyone's going to Ivy League college, everyone's doing really well, and then you go the opposite of saying, well, or I could go over here and no one's going to these schools, so I'm going to be the only one. Is it harder or is it? I guess where does that standout aspect? Because it would clearly you would clearly stand out at the high school,
Yes,
right
right.
at
It's
the
sort of the
school, and
big
you're going
fish,
to be like,
small
you know,
pond.
person over here, they're really smart, but how do how do admissions for universities look on that? Do they have lists of high schools that are in these smaller cities? They say, "Hey, we gotta hit our Idaho quota, so we gotta
Mhm.
make sure we're pulling in enough people from there, and it's a smaller sample."
Yeah, so let me sort of contextualize and explain kind of how applications are evaluated. And these are college applications. So typically they're read on a regional basis. And so there's an individual who's responsible on the university side for understanding a particular territory. And they are well versed in kind of the educational landscape of that area, what high schools are, what is the quality kind of the instruction and the level of rigor of the courses. And so they are reading kind of with that context in mind. I think, for some students, it is easier to kind of stand out, to kind of pop in an environment that is a little bit less kind of historically academically oriented, in a pool full of kind of legacy students, for example, where students and families have been kind of planning for the college process since practically infancy. The flip of that, though, is it's really important to make sure that your child is exposed to the appropriate level of challenge and rigor in high school. So, for example, just kind of signing up to send your child to a rural public high school somewhere in the middle of the country may not be all that advantageous because they're not going to have access to coursework that's going to sufficiently demonstrate their level of academic strength.
Gotcha. Alright. And how does that impact from international decisions too? I guess both on choice of school from what you're talking about, but also this concept of families moving with kids before college or during college. And how is that being in the mix? Has that changed at all since we last talked, or any trends there?
Yeah, so I'm seeing sort of two things. I think on the kind of high school student side of things, it's not new that we will have families come to us at some point in the student's high school trajectory and say, we're contemplating, sending our child for a year abroad, maybe a boarding school in another country. Wouldn't it be such a great experience for them to make friends, learn a new language? What is shifting somewhat is that parents are saying, well, maybe we'll join. Why not make this a family adventure? And again, I think that's sort of a function of remote work and the flexibility that that's afforded. So, for example, I talked to a student not or a family not long ago that decided to spend a year traveling with their three children on kind of a world tour. And they did a version of homeschooling. And again, that's more accessible. It's more possible today than it's been ever in the past. They're now back kind of embedded in the more traditional schooling that their kids had been doing previously. But it totally changed their son's approach to the college application process. Like he's now applying to universities that have campuses abroad. So NYU, for example, they have a campus in Asia, one in the Middle East, and he's even talking about wanting to be a travel writer professionally. So that's one kind of interesting example of the family making a decision that has educational implications and also kind of real personal reverberations as well.
Yeah, I could see how that's a lot easier for your pre-college years and to make
Hmm.
that choice because you have a little bit more control over where your kids are going to go. But I imagine if families with multiple children, that starts getting risky when you start picking up and moving to a location for some university, and then banking or having to gamble on the fact of all of your kids getting into that university or wanting to, or else
Yeah,
you're
no,
actually
I'm not sure that's
keep
exactly
moving.
advisable.
That seems like a big risk there of how you handle that. Is that common in the sense of whenever you start seeing families move for I imagine they're having to take into a lot of factors into account because you have to find kind of the one size fits all approach to a location that fits all the children's needs as opposed to, or do they just go all in on one of their kids? There is that the.
No, I think you're right. Most families are kind of mindful of the bigger picture. And when families are contemplating international moves, they're
Mhm.
typically looking at international schools that have IB programs or even offer AP classes so that the credits and kind of the schooling is more transferable. And we are seeing the rise of international campuses in locations that are attracting more sort of global families. For example, TASIS, which is one of the most kind of renowned European boarding school groups, just opened a campus outside of Lisbon, for example. And Lisbon's actually a hub where we've seen a lot of families relocate in recent years for a confluence of reasons when we're talking about kind of lifestyle and opportunity. And that's a great example of, okay, and then the education is kind of catching up.
Do you see that as an issue of families who move, let's say, from the US internationally for schooling, but then hoping to have their kids back in the United States for actual university education? Does that make things different, or does it really depend on the choice of the schools internationally?
It really depends, and that's often why, it's not at all unusual for families to come to us as they're thinking about a potential move abroad or even domestically to say, like, what are the implications? Is this school going to better position my child for college applications? Could it disadvantage them? And, we sort of play it out because it can go different ways. I mean, certainly coming from an international school is probably a safer bet. The curriculum is better understood. The level of rigor may be higher. But not always. Sometimes a local school in a different language certainly is an amazing kind of cultural experience for the student and family. And sometimes those are the most well regarded local schools. And so that can carry weight in the college application process as well. So that's really why, when we're consulting with families, we're not kind of meeting them in the final phase of, okay, let's execute on these college applications. We're starting to engage when the children are at the tail end of middle school, early high school, to say, how do we maximize the high school trajectory and how do we set that child up for success in whatever environment they end up being in.
Is that so that's your kind of go-to? I think we talked about this a little bit in the previous times we've talked around kind of 8th grade being that prime time to start making these decisions. But is that kind of the line that you would draw? Not saying that's impossible to start going later than that, but that's the ideal point to start making these decisions for schooling, which means you'd have to start making location decisions before that time or even in the earlier middle school years so that transition's a little bit easier.
Yes, I think you're characterizing that correctly. I mean, I always say to families, the right time to engage is really the right time for your child because different children are kind of waking up at different stages of this process. But I think if we want to be the most proactive, the most strategic, the most intentional, then the ideal time to really begin laying the groundwork is tail end of middle school into early high school. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is around course selection and course planning, and that's embedded within the context of school selection, right? So making sure that that student has access to challenging high level classes that are going to showcase their strengths. So that's kind of one piece. And I think as we can all appreciate, one course kind of builds on the next, right? You need to have access to a particular set of classes in order to kind of progress to that next level. And then the other piece of this is the narrative development component, right? So colleges are looking for a cohesive through line for each applicant of what have they done? What have they contributed? What impact have they made? And 10th grade is not the time to go all in, right? That narrative is the natural consequence of multiple years of learning and growth and exploration. And that's really what we're cultivating in our students.
How does that change from in the admissions process? Because what you just described is very different from where I think a lot of people think about the admissions process, and they think, "I need to submit my grades, and I need a really
Mhm,
good essay, and
mhm.
and I'm gonna submit those things, and it's gonna go through some algorithm, and I'm gonna get chosen or not chosen for the university." But what you're saying is almost like the resume approach, and it's that you're looking for this path that shows that this is a thoughtful approach, not just it's my junior year. I need to go volunteer for a lot of things that are all just random and throw it in just to fill the paper. But you see this kind of course that they've taken for 4 or 5 years. How does all the AI stuff now that we're seeing? Because there's universities are using a lot of technology to screen applications, to screen different locations. How many times are our eyes being put on paper? Do they need to be? And then is this a weird situation where if essays are still a prevalent portion of the whole process, how are universities adapting to the changes where you could have 10 applicants and Claude wrote all 10 of their applications or all 10 of their essays and they sound great?
Oh, it's such an interesting and sort of complicated moment. So I think I'll sort of backtrack for a moment to kind of hit on sort of contextually some of what you raised, which is why does narrative even matter? Kind of like what's the point here? And I think, at the most selective universities, as the number of applicants rises, acceptance rates drops, there's almost an expectation that most students will be applying with the very strongest grades and test scores. So then the question becomes, okay, what is differentiating about that student? And that's where the storytelling component is so paramount and why beginning earlier to craft a genuine and authentic narrative is essential because I I'm a true believer in there is no magic formula to this. The perfect applicant doesn't exist. The perfect applicant is the best, most deeply engaged, most highly committed version of any particular child. And obviously that has to build over time. So then that kind of brings us to the essay component. The essays, right, are the culmination of that story. Without those summer jobs and volunteer opportunities, there's no raw material to craft a compelling essay. You need sort of the essay fodder, the essay inspiration. In terms of the AI of it, we say to our students that this is an issue of both integrity and strategy. Colleges ask students during the application process to sign off that the work is authentically, originally their own. And so that obviously raises some flags about the use of AI in this process. But putting that aside, They're also screening for voice, for specificity, for uniqueness. And so it's an issue of strategy as well. Can AI be a helpful brainstorming tool? Absolutely. But it would be wildly disadvantageous for a student to submit a sort of flattened essay that looks and sounds like anybody else, because the whole point is that it's their opportunity to showcase themselves. And maybe there's even some benefit in being a little bit rough around the edges in kind of the world of AI flattening.
How fast are universities adapting to all of this, whether their use of it or their ability to incorporate any type of screening into whether or not that does affect their decisions?
They're moving fairly slowly, I would say. I mean, some schools have implemented AI tools to screen really for numbers. Some are more forthcoming than others about their use. For example, UNC has talked about how they're using it kind of in the evaluation process, but Duke down the road is saying we're not doing that. So it definitely varies school by school. And then from kind of the educational perspective too, colleges are deciding in real time how they want to integrate AI into their curriculum. Some schools are in the very early phases of thinking about how do we now test students once they arrive here to really elicit the information that we want to, right? And so schools are thinking about our oral exams, maybe something that we want to bring back rather than traditional essays. And colleges too are playing around with the notion of implementing kind of AI focused majors. So, Northwestern University, for example, is one such school that's in the process of bringing that into their curriculum. But it's highly variable.
Yeah, and when you mentioned a couple schools there on the AI side, but to circle back a little bit on your hubs of where people are moving, I imagine that starts to drive where decisions are being made, right? Because if depending on the speed of technology change, then if a school is embracing it, that seems to be something that I'd imagine that parents and families are looking at as something a little bit more comfortable, because I know one of the things I'm hearing in meetings regularly is we don't know what jobs are gonna be there or what
Yes.
jobs look like for our kids in the future. So, looking at universities through a new lens, not of, well, all these schools are really good schools, but now
Mhm.
it's which of these schools are actually going to be changing curriculum to
Yes.
take into account all of these factors. How are you seeing that being balanced with more of the geographic preferences, if there's any overlap there, or is one driving that direction
Hmm.
and choice?
It's a Yeah, it's a great question, and I think colleges are all trying to figure out how to keep up and also how to attract the strongest applicants in a world that is rapidly changing. And so what we're seeing from a college perspective is a rise in popularity in schools that are being increasingly thoughtful and forward looking about practical hands on experience. So, for example, Northeastern has a co op program that actually gives students work experience as part of the curriculum. It's really embedded in the undergraduate experience. And Northeastern has become increasingly popular, increasingly selective over the last decade. Certainly, that's been accelerated in the last handful of years. And I would attribute that largely to kind of the trends that you're describing. Um, and then, trying to sort of follow Northeastern's cues, we just noticed that Fordham University, for example, in New York City, uh, just announced that for, I believe, the class of 2029, they're going to guarantee an internship, a work experience, a research opportunity for every graduating student. So that I think is one of the ways that colleges are really looking to remain relevant in, kind of our shifting world.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot more sense. I'm happy to hear that because that's one of the, as you know, academia moves extremely slow in
Mhm.
in it, pretty much everything. So for to see that, and I think it's really easy to throw and say, well, we have a major now, or we have a class elective you can take that is AI. And that's really
Yeah.
not solving any of those problems that we've been talking about. What's actually solving is a completely new way to think about curriculum and how you're actually teaching courses. And I everything else. So that is really good to hear there.
So, and I would also just add, because I consider myself
Yeah.
sort of a proponent of the liberal arts. I was an English major myself. I mean, we're certainly seeing a reduction in the funding, the resources for many of those disciplines at, a number of schools. Syracuse University, for example, just announced that they're kind of shutting down a number of these kind of more liberal arts departments and laying off professors. But I would actually argue that in the world as it's becoming, those skills that come from a liberal arts education are more essential than ever. So the ability to think critically, interpret information, collaborate well with peers, express an opinion, all of that which the liberal arts teaches is no less important and perhaps more important when we think about kind of the soft skills in an AI driven world.
Yeah, I think that's I buy that argument of that being more of an issue because if you'd asked me, I mean, for experience of over a decade in academia, right? You look at how that was in 10 years ago, that wasn't the case, right? There was a big push toward the business school, right? Computer science. And now you're seeing, I think you'll see that shift. I don't think it's happened yet. I think there's still this push toward the hard skills, right? And the
Mhm.
technical skills are still there, but we're starting to see a lot of that shift. So yeah, I think you're right. If we were to look at that trend for the next
Let's
10
see.
years, that we shift back to that more liberal arts education. So but as we wrap up and everything today, uh, give us five of these new hubs that you're looking at for cities for where people are looking at. You mentioned Lisbon. I don't know if that makes your top five or if
Oh, I
that's
call
just
that
out
my
there.
top 5. We're seeing, some action in Milan. South Florida is booming. Actually, it's so funny. The schools have such long wait lists that local billionaires are actually investing in new campuses. So Jeff Green built a school in Palm Beach. Stephen Ross is working on forming 2 new campuses in South Florida just to accommodate the influx of families. So that includes Miami, Wellington, and then, we're also seeing families relocating to what were historically kind of vacation communities as a primary residence. So more families making roots kind of in the Hamptons and Lake Tahoe and other sort of former outposts.
Very good. Very good. Well, those all sound like good places. I don't
Yeah,
blame
I
you.
agree.
All right. Well, Lindsay, pleasure as always. Thank you very much for coming on to the show and sharing some of the newest trends. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's our show. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
The information provided in this podcast is for general informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to constitute financial, investment, or other professional advice. The opinions expressed are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of any affiliated organizations. Investing in financial markets involves risk, including the potential loss of principal. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Before making any investment decisions, you should consult with a qualified financial advisor who can assess your individual financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance. Thanks for listening.